This week on the Speakeasy podcast, we have a special treat for listeners. Monique Lahaie, a book enthusiast and blogger, sits down with Michael Christie, author of Greenwood. You can follow Monique at Monique_reads on Instagram. We also want to thank her again for this great conversation and keep an eye out for more collaborations between us in the near future.
Hi everybody, it's Monique Lahaie here. I'm a book blogger and a book reviewer over on Instagram at Monique_reads. I'm sitting down today with author Michael Christie to discuss his book, Greenwood. Michael Christie's novel, Greenwood, was a national bestseller and longlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize. His first novel, If I Fall, If I Die, was longlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize, the Kirkus Prize, and the International Impact Dublin Literacy Award, and was selected as a New York Times Editor's Choice title. He is also the author of a linked collection of stories, The Beggar's Garden, which was longlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize, shortlisted for the Rogers Writers' Trust Fiction Prize, and won the Vancouver Book Award. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Globe and Mail. A former carpenter and homeless shelter worker, he divides his time between Victoria and Galiano Island, where he lives with his wife and two sons in a timber frame house that he built himself. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure.
That's quite the bio to have at the back of your book. And I will say that what really hooked me in, I think, was I flipped to the back after I started Greenwood to read your author's bio, because I was lucky enough to have you join a book club chat that I was going to be a part of a discussion. And the line that really hooked me in and knew that you were not only talk the talk, but walk the walk was you built your own timber frame house, which is just absolutely crazy.
That's exactly what my wife said when we began to do it. It was a wonderful process. We live on a small island called Galiano Island, which is off the coast of Vancouver. And we got a hold of this small sort of piece of property, and there were a lot of really big trees, Douglas fir and western red cedar on the property that we had to take down to clear space for our house. And we thought, why don't we build the house out of the trees that we've cleared? And so I'd done some construction and carpentry kind of work in the past, and I thought, why not try to do it ourselves? And so, I didn't do every single thing. Like, I didn't wire the electrical panel and stuff like that because I'm not completely insane. But I did the majority of the construction, and my wife did a whole bunch as well too. So she deserves credit, of course.
That's amazing. I can't imagine taking that on and building your own house. But I think that, like I said, that's what really hooked me into this story, because Greenwood is a cross-generational story. And I don't want to give any spoilers, because my end goal with this podcast is to make people go buy this book, because I think it should be on everyone's bookshelf. But just seeing that you talk about a great withering in Greenwood, and there's a lot of environmental activism throughout the novel, and just hearing that is something that you are clearly passionate about as well. So do you want to just tell me about how you originally had the idea to write this book and what made you start?
Sure. Yeah, it's sort of a notoriously difficult novel to summarize. I've had people at the marketing departments of publishers say like, this is very difficult to pitch because it's a lot of things kind of at the same time. It's a family story. It's a family saga. It's also a semi kind of dystopian novel to some degree, but it's also a historic work of historical fiction too. So it's tricky, but it basically tells the story of the Greenwood family over 130 years, 5 different generations of the family, and the sort of unifying detail about each family member is that everyone has something to do with trees and forests. So there's an environmental activist, as you said, and there's a timber tycoon, and there's a carpenter, and various people. So the book sprung, I guess, from my desire to write about certain characters who are part of the family. Often my ideas begin as just people that I'm interested in, or people who I've imagined. And, you know, it is an environmentally sort of focused novel. It's certainly, you know, any book about a calamity like the Great Withering that strikes the earth and destroys most of the Earth's trees is, you know, going to have some environmental resonance or some resonance with the environmental cause. But I didn't want to be preachy about it. So I didn't want to, because I generally will, you know, assume that anyone who's picking up literary fiction, environmentally focused literary fiction, is not like a Trump supporter who's looking to, not that, you know, but not to stereotype, but who doesn't believe in climate change and who isn't interested in the environment at all. And so I kind of began, you know, thinking about the book as a way to explore these ideas without being preachy, because that's what I really love about fiction. It can really get into the emotional content of things we may know intellectually, but we don't feel as strongly as we could. So, but the basic idea for the structure of the novel, which the story is told in narrative rings. So it begins in the future, starts going back in time, mirroring the rings of a tree, and then to the very beginning of the family, and then back out to the future again. So that idea actually came to me when I was cutting down a tree. Not a huge tree. It had to be moved or had to be taken out because our driveway was going through this particular area. So I cut down the tree and it fell, and my sons were kind of there with me. They were very small, but they were very excited. And so we all were looking at the stump, and they were asking me about the rings. And I was, you know, describing to them how each year a tree adds a new ring. And you know, it occurred to me that a tree's structure is almost like a narrative of its own life. Like it's own story, and it's containing its own story within its structure. So I sort of a light bulb went on, and I thought, what a interesting way to structure a gigantic 550-page novel. And after that, the book really kind of opened up and was a lot easier to write once I had that structure.
Thank you. So what was the research process like? Because you do go all across Canada, and I think that was one of the reasons I personally really connected to the book. I think that there's a little bit of serendipity that happens sometimes when a reader reads a book, that it's just not only a fantastic novel, but at the right time that you need to read that. And I think Greenwood was that book for me. I read it. It was one of my first books of the year. And I just missed going home for Christmas, which I told you I am from the East Coast. And I read that St. John was a part of this book. And I was just like, you know what? This cross-country road trip, well, train trip type novel that also reconnects you to nature in a way was just exactly what I needed after the pandemic, after not seeing my family. It just kind of hit all those marks for me. So what was the research process like for you? How did you pick those Canadian cities? How did you match the time frames? Because we're all over the place, like you said, with time frames too. So how did this all come together from your perspective to make sure you had things accurate as well?
Yeah, I mean, the research in particular was fun and illuminating and exciting, but also very extensive and difficult. And so, yeah, because when you have 5 different time periods, you have to sort of do 5 different sets of research. So I would kind of immerse myself, say, in 1974 for a period of time, and I, would read. So that section focuses on an environmental activist who travels around the Pacific Northwest and kind of sabotages logging equipment in an effort to save the old growth for forests in particular. And so, yeah, it was, I listened to the music of the time, reading novels written during that time, but also just doing a ton of research around the environmental movement and around, early days of Greenpeace. And I interviewed a number of people, read up on this kind of direct action type protest. So, yeah, I mean, research is a dangerous thing for a writer in the sense that you can really get drawn in and you can end up going down that rabbit hole and forgetting that you're writing a book. So you need to be careful of that. but at the same time, you do need to have an authentic feeling to those time periods. You need detail, and you need sort of the spirit of the time to permeate your book. So I took the book took me 5 years of like full-time writing to complete. So a lot of that was research. And as far as the trip goes, I mean, I've been across Canada numerous times. I've actually hopped trains in my youth. Wouldn't do it today, but did it, and was struck by like the incredible beauty, I mean, of Canada from coast to coast. I think it's something that we take for granted, and it's something that we easily forget, but it is such a dramatic and beautifully sort of laid out land that we live in. And, and a train trip is an incredible way to see it kind of untouched, because those rail lines often are very far from roads, far from cities even. So you get this kind of view of the natural world that is, for me as a young man, was completely just staggering. So I guess I've always loved books that involve some kind of journey. I don't know if it's, the influence of the Odyssey or the, all of these great or the Lord of the Rings was a favorite book as a kid. So I knew that I these characters going on this journey was a big part of the story pretty early on. So it was a fun thing to write, though of course I had no idea that the pandemic would someday make people very excited about taking a journey because they were trapped in their houses. But yeah, that part was very enjoyable for me.
Yeah, traveling across Canada can be a very remote and isolating experience in itself. So you did a great job captivating the beauty of the country while, the vastness and the remoteness. I actually did do a pandemic safe vacation where I drove home last summer. I'm a teacher, so I have the summers off. Yep. And I had to drive to Thunder Bay, and then I drove by myself from Thunder Bay all the way to the St. John area. And so again, I think that's why I really connected to this book. It was serendipity. I did that long road trip by myself, which is a long time to spend with your thoughts in a car. And just, got to see that similar path to what they were taking, but I did the car route rather than the train. So yeah, you did a really good job captivating that. Speaking of the pandemic, what was it like to release a book during a pandemic? And I know you have books from before, so you did experience, pre-pandemic release versus now. How was it different?
I mean, it was very surreal. I actually had a sort of an Australian tour that was rolling into an American tour planned. And this was like late January, early February of last year. And so, there was these first rumblings as I departed for Australia. There were these first sort of whisperings of the pandemic, and I saw some people with masks in the airport, and I was a little bit like, okay, well, at this point, it seems like it's, a manageable amount of risk. And my publisher were like, yeah, we feel okay with you going. And so I went, but then as I was in Australia, things started to get worse. And so every day I was on the phone with, various people to, decide whether we should call it off, what we should do. So I ended up doing the Australia part, going to the US, did a few dates in the US, and I was at a little tour where I was doing little readings, and I just saw the sort of the attendance of each reading was just declining steadily. And then at one point in Northern California, that someone showed up. They were one of two people in the audience. There was a 2-person audience, and one of them was wearing like a full face shield and like mask and like actually sort of like a latex kind of suit. And I was like, okay, this is getting pretty wild. And so we pulled the plug and actually took a ship, because I didn't want to get on an airplane at that point. So I took a ship from Seattle home to Victoria, and then to Galliano. So yeah, I got a sort of a firsthand look at, the airports and the hotels of the world as they kind of emptied out, which was very bizarre and very surreal. And so, yeah, it was certainly a different experience than any other book I've ever released. But I, definitely wasn't complaining. I'm sort of more concerned about the health of the people of the world than I am about my own book tour. So I'm not going to complain about it, but it was an interesting time. That's for sure. Very stressful.
Yeah, for sure. I think that one thing that I found interesting since this all started is I really did dive back into reading. I've always been a reader, but escapism is crucial in times like these. But it's also, with technology, I've been so lucky to connect like this with authors and other readers in a way that, not that we couldn't before, but I just don't think it was as prominent of something that would happen, like online book tours and online, author interviews that I've gotten to sit down and, watch. Where I live, we don't even have a bookstore.
Right.
So it's been kind of cool in that sense for me. And I hope that we can continue the online book talks even when this is over, which is hopefully going to happen. So you have a lot of interesting characters in this book, and you said that they were, inspirations from maybe people you've met. Are there any that you connect with on a personal level? Any that you feel are most like you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I often say that I have trouble writing about anyone, any character, if I don't have at least some kind of emotional connection to their struggle. Like I've done journalism in the past, I've done other forms of writing, and I can admit now that I was terrible at it. And there's something to do with the fact that I need to be emotionally invested in the people and the places that I'm writing about, or else I'm just like bad. And so even though Greenwood is composed of a really kind of diverse group of characters, each person I feel a certain kind of emotional resonance with, and I feel like I understand them at least on some level. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm a bit of me as in everyone in the book, every major character at least. But I can say that there's a brother relationship between Everett and Harris that's pretty foundational to the Greenwood family and to the story itself. And I have an older brother myself, and him and I had a very kind of difficult but also super loving and wonderful relationship. He's like a finance guy. We were very different from one another growing up, and so we there's certainly resonances of our relationship in the Harris Everett relationship. And another thing is, I lost both of my parents to cancer sort of just prior to the writing of Greenwood and during the writing of Greenwood. And so, there are someone asked me recently and said, wow, there are a lot of orphans and there are a lot of people searching for homes and a lot of people who are, looking for parental figures, and all this stuff is happening. And so I must admit the fact that there is a great deal of my own kind of emotional struggle in the novel as well. Like people looking for homes, people making families, people looking for love, essentially. And so, yeah, there's, it's, when I really think about it, and I try not to, but I really don't know where my own kind of emotional world stops and where the world of Greenwood begins. Do you know what I mean? They're woven together in a way that I don't think I ever could unravel.
You can tell that it's a very personal story, because I think that's why it's so impactful. And so many people have such an emotional attachment. As I was saying, we did have a chance to talk to you at a book club. Yeah. And I think everybody got a little teary-eyed by the end of the conversation, because everybody had such vastly different emotional connections to this book. So that must be kind of strange for you too, to see that how connected people are to something that is so personal to you.
I mean, I love it. The reason I read is to empathize and is to identify and is to see into people's lives and feel along with them. I think that is the great power of fiction. The books that I truly, truly love do that. And so with Greenwood, I was really trying to write something that would connect with people on that emotional level. And so, I mean, to hear people say that they've had that experience with the book is just music to my ears. I mean, it's really the reason that I read, and it's the reason that I write. I don't write to demonstrate the fact that I'm smart or to, like, impress people, or, the true wonderful thing about writing and reading is that humanity and that human connection that we can develop with one another and with characters that I think really benefits us as human beings.
Were there any characters that you didn't know where their story was going to go, and then you wrote it and it kind of surprised you? Because I know there's one character in particular whose story did surprise me. There is, without spoiling anything, of course. I was shocked by Lomax as a character.
Yeah.
Did you know where everyone was ending up, or was it kind of, you planned it, but they kind of had their own mind as well?
Yeah, there are certain things you plan. Like it's not as much plan for me as like just seeing a signpost kind of way down the road and knowing that that's the direction you're going, but not knowing exactly what's going to happen until you get there. And then there are just these things that are kind of happy accidents, in the words of Bob Ross, and they just happen as you're going. And Lomax certainly was a character I knew was going to come apart to some degree, but I didn't know what exactly that would look like. And also, I mean, so someone pointed this out to me recently, and I thought it was a really great observation that, there's a character, Everett, in the book who's in the process of coming back from a destroyed state and moving towards being able to love and being able to find a kind of a family. And that was almost an inversion of Lomax's journey, which is beginning with a family and losing everything, in a sense. And so no spoilers, but there's this kind of parallel journey between those two characters that they're almost opposites in a sense. And I love those, they're things that you're not conscious of when you're writing the novel, but as soon as people point them out, I'm like, oh yeah, of course. Yes, that's exactly what I was doing with the book.
Yeah, what I really loved about a lot of the characters, as you said, there's people finding families, but there's different types of family and different types of love throughout the story. And I really, really enjoyed that, and seeing, all of them clearly had different definitions of, what's important and family and all of that. So I really loved I don't know how you tied everything together the way you did, but there's a lot. This book it's a thick book, but it's also a heavy book that has a lot going on in there. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I knew that, I've read a 600-page book that I've felt like, wow, this didn't earn its 600 pages, or it didn't draw me through these 600 pages. And so I knew that if I was going to be writing a big kind of epic family saga, that it would need to be propulsive, and I would need to leave out the parts that weren't essential. And then, for that, if you can do that, then you can generate a pretty exciting reading experience that, that at the end of it, the reader is not exhausted, which was my hope. So
Greenwood is actually not my normal genre, and it's not a book that I'm super intimidated by large books. And I need a lot of motivation to pick them up and start reading them for that reason, because I've been let down before of books that don't live up to 600 pages. And that's a commitment. That's a big time commitment to invest into. But the actual physical copy of Greenwood that I have is just stunning. It's an absolutely stunning book. I have the one that has the tree edges on the sides, and at the back, like the detail is just unreal that it has like property of willow Greenwood, which is something I didn't notice until I kind of flipped back and was spending some time with the book before our conversation today. And the level of detail and the beauty of this book is just mind blowing. So that definitely drew me to it. What process did you design the book? Or I know you had also talked about it being an eco-friendly book. If you want to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the subject matter of the book, it's a book about trees and forests, but it's also a book about paper, and it's about libraries, and it's about books themselves. And so, we recognized pretty early on that it was kind of a unique opportunity to really produce something that felt special and felt like it was drawing attention to the actual physical book itself. And I was lucky enough to have a publisher and an editor who, recognized that very early on and put a ton of work. Certainly did not design the book myself, nor would you want me to. My visual aesthetic sense is horrible. But I did have some say in the wood grain edges of the pages. It's called 4-edge printing, which is something I learned. And that was done by Jennifer Griffiths, who's a brilliant designer and artist herself. So there was people often think, you see one name on a book and you think that, oh, this one person has produced this object of art, but truly it is a collaborative effort, and you work alongside all these really brilliant and creative people together to produce this thing. And so it was those little details. I love that stuff. I'm a nerd. I'm a nerdy person with respect to how things are designed, and just when you get that sense that there's been some real care and attention put into something. I mean, I love that. And so I was really excited to be able to do that with this book. And, it was published by McClellan Stewart, who are a part of Penguin Random House. So it was a big publisher, but they were very committed to publishing the book as sustainably as they could. And it was actually, I've been told that it's one of the most, if not the most sustainably published books in Canada kind of ever produced. So that, from the glue to the ink to it's like soy-based ink, and it's all, ancient forest-friendly paper. And even in the editing process, my editor and I worked only on recycled paper as we went through the manuscripts. And that's something I'm very proud of. And it was a great pleasure for me to be able to put out a book like that, and to have it be not only a beautiful object, but a sustainable one as well.
I'm definitely not anti ebooks, but if anyone's going to pick up Greenwood, I definitely recommend that they physically hold the book, because like I said, it's stunning, and I think it resonates better as you're reading this book to have a physical copy in your hands for sure. You do a ton of world building, even though it is in Canada and it's all very realistic. You completely immerse us in a whole other world. So I was excited to see that it may have been optioned for television as well.
Yes, it has been. Yeah, it's this great producer who's worked on stuff like Westworld and The Eddy recently. It was a show he did for Netflix. His name's Alan Poole. He's a fantastic guy, and they've optioned the book. And the idea is to turn it into a 10-ish episode series. And because there's a lot of discussion around whether it could be a feature film, and I was kind of very against that idea from the beginning, and then everyone is now on board with that as well, because there's so much narrative. And I really think that the new kind of limited series, long form television format is really, really lends itself to, novels in particular, and big kind of epic stories like this. So yeah, we're working on it now. I mean, the pandemic has thrown a monkey wrench into a lot of production, but we're moving forward. And I mean, I'll be happy if it doesn't happen, and I'll be happy if it happens. It's, it would be a great thing. And, there's a lot to see on the screen in the book, and I can't help but imagine, certain sections and how they would look, and, but I try not to get too far ahead of myself, just because it's, ultimately my job is to write books, and that's sort of what I'm most excited about.
So it is still early stages, but will you be involved in the process if and when it's happening?
Yeah, I mean, part of the deal is I'm going to be an executive producer of the series if and when it happens, which I'm really excited about. And I'm just learning about all this stuff, but it's a very collaborative and complex process to get one of these things made. And so I'm just happy to be along for the ride and to have some input into what it will look like and how it will be filmed, because I've obviously know writers who've been in an alternate situation where the book just becomes something that they're kind of like, what the heck is this, at the end. And so that is not going to happen for Greenwood, which is very comforting. But yeah, it's exciting. And I think in particular, the narrative structure, like we've done a lot of discussion around how to tell the story in 10 episodes. Do we sort of start in the future and work our way back into the tree as the book, progresses, or do we chop things up a little bit more and have sections from the various time periods kind of woven together throughout the 10 episodes? So that's been a really fun kind of puzzle to work out.
Well, I will be cautiously optimistic, and I'm glad to hear that you are involved in the creative process, because I know there's nothing worse as a reader than having somebody botch one of your favorite books into television or a movie, and I can't imagine the devastation as an author. So.
I try not to imagine it, but I was there were many people who were interested in the book, and this situation is sort of the most creatively kind of exciting and least risky seeming for me to get involved in. You know what I mean? So it's I have a lot of faith and a lot of trust in the folks that I'm working with, that it's going to be something to be proud of at the end.
Fingers crossed on that one.
Yes.
So,
yes.
What are you working on now? What's coming next?
I'm working on a new novel that is, it's different in the sense that it's kind of more condensed. But as I'm writing it, and as my wife is also a writer, and we're sort of first readers for each other, and she's often very good at pointing out things early on that I may not be aware of, but she's read sections of this new book, and she's like, "Oh, of course, this is all the same themes that you have always been interested in, and they're just reappearing," which I love. I mean, I love that there are often for writers these things that you return to, and these types of situations that keep recurring in your work. So yeah, it's set on a small fictional island off the coast of Vancouver, but more remote kind of than the one I live in. And it's about the disappearance of a child and kind of how that impacts the community on the island. And it sort of goes into the various folks who live there. And that's what it is.
That sounds right up my alley. I'm a huge mystery lover, so I'm really
Yeah,
excited about that.
it's sort of a literary take on a situation that's pretty familiar to a lot of genre fiction, but I'm kind of hoping to have sort of a twist on the genre, and try to because I love those books too, and I love suspense, and I don't really make much distinction in my mind between literary fiction and genre fiction. I think it's kind of absurd mostly, or just more just a way to organize a bookstore than it does mean anything. You know what I mean? And so yeah, I often just welcome in genre type stuff into my work. So yeah, it's that's what it is.
Did you always know you wanted to be a writer?
I don't think I didn't. I often hear people say that they did, and I believe them, but I try to imagine anything I knew for certain at 6 or 10, and I don't think I can't think of anything. And so, but I always read. I grew up in a house full of books, and I grew up in Thunder Bay, place you mentioned earlier, and in kind of like a working class-ish house, but at the same time there were books everywhere. And my mother, who's huge influence on me, and was a big part of me becoming a writer, was agoraphobic for much of her life. So she had panic anxiety, was went through all kinds of treatment and all kinds of difficulty, but basically that she didn't leave the house for much of my childhood. And so what she did was she read, and she painted, and she made things, and she just kind of created this amazing creative space in our house. And so she encouraged me to write, and I would stay home with her a lot, and we would just kind of do stuff together. And so from her, I really learned my appreciation for, reading, but also just like creativity in general, and really just getting excited about making things. That was always what we did together. So, yeah. So I guess in that sense, I knew I wanted to grow up to be a person who did something creative. I just didn't know what exactly.
I think a lot of people who get into writing or reading as adults started as kids, and there's always books that mean a lot to us, and we get a little defensive about them and love them and carry them with us forever. What are those books for you?
Oh man, I was such a nerd, and I loved. I still am a nerd. I should not use the past tense. I was really into comic books. I was also really into like Garfield and Calvin and Hobbes, and like cartoon, I guess they're called, comic strips. But then also just like I remember loving Nancy Drew, like being obsessed with Nancy Drew, more than the Hardy Boys. I remember being like, I hate the Hardy Boys. I love Nancy Drew. But then also, obviously like fantasy was a big thing for me, Tolkien. And I just, I was a weird kid, and I really just read, like, I would pick up my mom's like Danielle Steele novels and just like read, and totally inappropriate reading for a 12-year-old. But I just loved to take a book off the shelf and just see what was in it. For me, that was like the whole world was up on the shelf, and all I had to do was pull it down a bit at a time. And, I still read that way. I love to read widely and voraciously. But yeah, so, I mean, it's so hard to list. What were books for you that were like huge?
I loved all of the Roald Dahl books. I really I got really into those, and I actually come from a family who are not big readers. Mm-hmm. So kind of the same thing as you, except for we would go to the thrift store, and I would be allowed to choose whatever 3 books that I wanted.
Awesome.
it was kind of like the same thing because my parents didn't know a lot about books, but definitely wanted to, let me love books and then wanted me to love books. So they would just kind of be like, yeah, sure, pick whatever ones you want. So same thing. Like I was reading probably adult novels younger than I should have been as well. But I loved Roald Dahl. I loved The Babysitter's Club. Got me into a series which kind of hooked me. And also, again, going to those thrift stores and trying to find the numbers that I didn't have to bring them home with me. And then as I got older, I was a scaredy cat. I was scared of everything as a kid. But I read Goosebumps probably above the age of a normal kid when they would read them. And I read them all. And then I think that's kind of when I started loving mysteries and that kind of suspenseful books into adulthood. But yeah, I don't know. Roald Dahl was my hook in. And then he had all those movies that came out, which really gets you when I was around 8, 9. So
Matilda, that is the best one. I think that's my favorite. Yeah. So good.
Matilda. I really liked the BFG and I loved Witches. Witches was my favorite.
Witches is terrible. I recently read it I began it to my 6-year-old son, and he was like terrified. It was really, and I got sort of a chilled feeling as I was reading it. There's a darkness to the Witches that is really absent in at least the YA kind of literature that I've read recently. You know what I mean? There's a really kind of a scary undercurrent to that book.
Oh, it's definitely spooky. And it's probably the book that I read right before I was like, I'm ready for Goosebumps.
Right.
Let's go. I always had a fascination with witches after that. And we were driving distance from Salem and Salem, Massachusetts. So we went when I was in middle school, shortly after I read that book. So yeah, definitely started loving all of the spooky books around that time and realizing that there's not really anything to be afraid of.
Totally. Yeah. And that's the approach that my wife and I really take with our sons, is just like, read whatever you want. I mean, obviously we try to shield them from books that are going to be like deeply disturbing, but we, have a really kind of open policy, and it's amazing to see where their like tastes will go. Like they'll often be like just picking up a book that I think is maybe way ahead of where they're at, and they'll get a lot out of it. And so it's just I think when I grew up, certainly in school, books were kind of framed as almost like tests for you. Like they were, you know what I mean? Like there were ways to prove how smart you were by the depth with which you could observe what was going on. And they were sort of like almost like torture devices, and I remember reading like Catcher in the Rye or, books like that, or To Kill a Mockingbird, and just hating them because of how they were framed in the educational system. And then I read them later and it's like, oh my God, these books are amazing. Like why did, they could have been framed in such a more sort of joyful and exciting way than they were in school. And I think the education system is figuring that out now. And I do see a lot more like reading for excitement and reading for joy happening in schools now. And I'm sure you know a lot about that as a teacher, but at least for me as a kid, it wasn't until later that I was like, oh, right. Every book is actually like a fantastic, wonderful thing that is not like a test. Do you know what I mean? And so, yeah.
I think I'm still like that as an adult. If you tell me I have to do something,
right,
I don't want to do it. So
yeah,
maybe book reviewing isn't the best idea for me sometimes. Because if I'm not in the mood to read a book and I force myself to read it, I'm not going to enjoy it. It's just, it could be the best book that ever existed. But like I said, it's about, I like to call it book serendipity, of the right book at the right time for the right mood that makes you feel the way you need to feel in that moment. And right. I could read a brilliant book and hate it because I was cranky and I needed something happy and light and uplifting. And this book is sad and sorrowful. And ripped my soul out. So I don't like it. So I try really hard to be conscious of, of course, trying to meet review deadlines, but also reading books that I want to read and when I feel like reading them. And I think that that's so important for kids too. And like that, letting them go and pick out their own books and, walk away with those is so important. And I think that that's what really hooks people into readers. And I think that that has to happen at home too. Like you have to have, I'm so thankful that my parents did that and were like, yep, pick whatever book you want. And really fostered my love of reading by letting me read what I liked. So
that's fantastic. I agree.
Well, thank you so much for sitting down with me. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add or tell our listeners today or.
No, I mean, I just want to thank you for your engagement with Greenwood. It's been a different experience, particularly with this book, where there's been this really kind of exciting online engagement for the book. Like I get there, while I did so much less publicity for this novel than I have for any other book, there's just been this kind of upswell of support for it, I guess, online. And it's just really gratifying and fun to see. And to see your work connect with readers in the way that you sort of intended when you wrote it for 5 years, all alone, to be met with this community kind of spirit is just really wonderful. So I can't thank you enough for connecting with the book and reading my work. It's a great feeling.
Well, thank you so much for writing it. And I hope that everybody runs, don't walk, to either online or to the bookstore. But if you're buying online, buy from your independent local bookstores.
Yes.
To buy Greenwood, because like I said, I think it's one that everybody's going to want to not only read, but to actually physically have sitting on their shelves after. And you can do it guilt-free. It's a sustainable book. So, thank you so much for taking time out of your Sunday to sit down with me and talk about this book. Like I said, I read it at the beginning of the year, and I have no doubt that it'll make my top list for 2021 of books that I've read. It's phenomenal. It's immersive, and I absolutely love it. And it's going to always hold a special place in my heart. And thank you again for having this conversation, because your passion about this book made me love it even more after I got to talk to you the first time. So I really am excited to bring this to more listeners who can hopefully listen to you speak and hear about how much you love writing this book, and how, again, as I said earlier, you not only talk the talk, but you walk the walk. And just connect you and your story into the Greenwood story.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again for listening to Monique Lahaie's conversation with author Michael Christie. It was a great change of pace to Speakeasy's business as usual, and we look forward to similar chats Monique may graciously host for us down the road. Once again, you can follow her on Instagram at Monique_reads. Again, if you haven't already, please like, subscribe, and follow us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you find yourselves listening. If you enjoy the content and message we're putting out, please consider donating to us either through PayPal for single-time donations or Patreon for monthly contributions. They can be found on our homepage under the Donate tab, Speakeasy, Speak Free.